Welcome to the Academic Writing Amplified podcast. On this podcast, we believe that the culture of academia needs to change radically. Women and non-binary people are revolutionizing academia within institutions that were not built for us. If you're ready to reject the culture of overwork, kick guilt and overwhelm to the curb, and amplify your voice to make a real impact on your field without breaking down or burning out, you're in the right place. With our team of experienced writing coaches as co-hosts, we'll share insights and talk to inspiring guests to bring you the practical strategies, systems, and mindset shifts you need to find time to write, publish work you love, and design your career on your terms. And it all starts with writing. Let's go. All right. Hello, friends. Today we're here with my coach, Natalie Miller. And I'm so excited, Natalie, to have you on the podcast. I talk about you on the podcast a lot, and I wrote about you in my book. So I hope this is like a special treat for our audience. I would love for you to introduce yourself, because I could do like a big introduction, but I'm like, how is Natalie going to introduce herself today? Speaking of improvisational.
Gosh, yeah. Actually, I love that you said that. How am I going to introduce myself today? Because I am just such a person who believes in evolution, right? Like we're always changing. That's why I love working with you, because you're so growth oriented and willing to shift and change and evolve. So thank you for that. I'm a coach. I'm especially a coach for coaches, but maybe more than that, I'm a coach for people who are having very high standards for themselves, for the world, for their families. And I love that about us. I'm one of these people too. I love that about us. And also, boy, do I know the quicksand and the snares that are present when we are moving through life like that. So I help people navigate that. Yeah.
Awesome. And actually leads right into the question that kind of sparked the idea for this podcast, which is, and so I thought we'd start with this because who knows where the conversation will go. But though the thing that made us say we should do a podcast about this was I was telling you about something I hear from my academic clients a lot, especially women. And they say something like this. It goes like this. If I don't do this thing that I hate, this thing that I don't want to do, this thing that they keep asking me to do, the thing I've done every year for whatever reason, if I don't do this thing, who will?
Right.
So I thought we could dig it. Let's just like start there.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I feel like I'll have to say, like, truthfully for myself, sometimes I feel a little frustrated because I'm like, that's not a good enough reason. But I know it's like really a reason for my clients. So your thoughts about if I don't do it, nobody will. Or if I don't do it, who will?
Right. If I don't do it, who will? If I don't do it, nobody will. And maybe there's also a thing in there that is like, if I don't do it, it won't be done to my standard.
Yes.
I think actually that is often what it is. It's like, well, I could delegate that, but then it wouldn't happen to my standard. So here's my guess. And I wish we could see every listener like hearing me say this, but were you, and this, I'll ask you, Kathy, were you the student in middle school that when there was a group project, you just went ahead and did the group project?
Oh, yeah, of course. Yes, right? Of course. Yeah.
I have a feeling if you're listening to this podcast, you were also that person. You were the person that you got put in a little group and you were like, okay, either you ran it like a corporate meeting or you just went ahead and did it all yourself because you were the star student, because you were not about to get a bad grade or disappoint a teacher, because that was like such a part of your identity, right?
Yeah.
And I'm using second person, but I really should be using like a plural first person. That's me too. I was that person.
Yeah.
Too. And I actually have a 13-year-old who is that person. And oh my God, she's just like, yeah, I mean, I'm just writing everything. And I'm like, right?
Yes.
So here's the thing. That actually works, I guess, in middle school, high school. I don't think it's particularly fair or equitable or just or anything like that, but like you can do that, right?
Right.
Once you have achieved many projects in your life, like a job, a committee placement, a household, a parenting situation, like once you have achieved many different group projects, right?
Yes.
It is less and less possible, like literally possible to do it all, right?
Right.
So to me, it's kind of like the beginning is realizing this actually was a winning strategy at some point. This did get you an A on your group history project in 11th grade.
Yes.
But this strategy no longer serves you where you are now.
Yeah. And I want to offer some kind of thoughts about working in institutions, because I think a lot of the time, well, all of my clients, right, are professors, like academics, scholars working in institutions.
Yep.
And so I think this, like, if I don't do it, who will, is contextualized right inside of these institutions that are asking us to do more and more and more all the time, and providing us with fewer and fewer and fewer resources to do it. So that's like the internal question, right? It's like, oh, this is now maybe a strategy that used to work for me that doesn't work for me anymore. From the other side, from the institutional side, I want people to start to question, like, why is there work that only one person can do? Like, why does that exist?
Right.
One of the areas that I see this happening a lot, and it makes it worse, it makes it harder to say no to, is things like student advising. Like, I think this particularly came from a client that we were talking about, and we did this too in my department. It was like, you had a committee, it was called and in my department, it was called the orientation committee. And it was like, you would divide up the undergrads, and you were like in charge of making sure, like a bunch of professors were in charge of like helping the undergrads, fill out their plan of study and not go down a rabbit hole and graduate on time. Right.
Sure.
And this is for students, either they ignore you completely and then they don't graduate on time and then there's a mess, or you have students and you have to meet with them and it takes a lot of time and all these things. And there used to be maybe somebody in your department that had the role of academic advisor, but now that person's been cut. So it's like distributed somehow, but it's not, because you don't have time for that.
Right.
And so that is like part of this context of like, if I don't do it, no one else will. Poor students. When really the responsibility for the students, to me, right, is your institution and your department. So it's not you personally.
Yeah.
But yet we're put in these situations.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think this is the thing, right, is that part of having high standards for ourselves and for the world is we take responsibility.
Yeah.
And it becomes over responsibility, which I've discovered is like the through line of all the different people I work with are over responsible.
Yeah.
Right. And so I love this, but this is actually, right, part of it is that like, I am committed to these students. I am committed to excellence in my department. Like, I'm here because I want to make a difference. So I'm not going to like phone it in. I'm not going to just
right.
like let these kids fall through the cracks, right? These students fall through the cracks. And at the same time, like you say, the ask itself is way too big.
Yeah. I think one of the things that we worked on in coaching together that has stuck is this over responsibility. But I think at some point you called it hyper responsibility. And then I was like, oh,
yeah,
like even over responsibility for a very responsible person still sounds okay.
Mm-hmm.
Like I can be overly responsible, But hyper responsible. Oh, okay. Now I get it, Natalie. Hyper responsible.
Yeah. I love that distinction, Kathy, because also, right, you're like, yeah, over. Of course, I'm an over everything.
I'm over. Yes.
I'm over. I'm extra, as they say, right?
Yes.
Yeah. But no, hyper, right? And then I think it really does become an excellent question to ask in this place is, okay, when I am hyper responsible, and this could be for advising undergraduates, this could also be for meal planning in my home. Like I'm the only person who ever does it. I'm the only person who ever thinks about getting food into the house and then into people's bellies, right? Like wherever it is that you're over responsible is like, okay, so what does my hyper responsibility cost me? And also my hyper responsibility, what does it cost the system that I'm working in? What does it cost the household? What does it cost the institution? Right? Because the institution is probably saving money, but there is a cost to the institution at like trying to foist an unsustainable responsibility onto its faculty, right? Maybe that looks like people are leaving. I mean, there's all kinds of ways we can calculate that cost. Yeah. I love those questions, Kathy, because something that a person with high standards likes to do is mitigate costs, right? Like we're like, oh, hold on. This is causing some detriment. Like this is harmful in some way. Let me reassess and reevaluate.
Yeah.
Right. So what do you see for your people? What do you see as the personal costs of this over responsibility or hyper responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very well documented that the service burden, falls on academic women more than men. So there's like part of it is just that, like that you have a certain number of hours in your work week. You're already pushing the boundaries of those hours. And then you are continuing to accept responsibility for more and more things. And the hours are just like bursting and overflowing. So it costs you energetically and time-wise, but it costs your writing and it costs your scholarship moving forward, which I think is another thing that it also costs the institutions. They just don't think of it that way because I just, made an institution into a human. but like the institution or the culture of academia kind of says, you alone are responsible for your publications and your quote unquote scholarly productivity, right? So if you don't hit the bar that you want to hit, then it's on you.
Right.
But at the same time, they're creating conditions, or the institution, the culture also creates conditions in which they're continuing to like overburden you. So you being able to make choices that help you to preserve your time in a way that lets you publish like is harder and harder and harder. So it costs the institution because they're creating unsustainable work environments. It also costs their own faculty productivity, which they say they care about, but then don't take any responsibility for either. And another thing that hyper responsibility like costs people is like the students, or like in the family situation, it costs your family members. Like your children never learn how to meal plan.
Right.
Like you prevent them. And that is actually really paternalistic.
Yeah.
Like, no, I'm the only one who can be responsible, even though this like human who can make his own way to the grocery store if he needed to, like could take the responsibility. Or this teenager could look at the ingredients that are in the fridge and make something, like there's a lot. It doesn't really do any good for anybody.
Right.
Truthfully.
Right. It doesn't. And I think that where it's hard for me too. Hey, listen, it's hard for me too, right? I'm doing this right now in terms of my like social media posting, right?
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I want help with this, but also my standard is very high. And so it's like, okay, well, when I am trying to evolve the situation, right, in a way that, okay, I still get to have my high standards because I'm never going to ask you to let those go. Like, no, keep your high standards. Like, I love that you have high standards. And at the same time, it's like there's a broadening of the high standard to include something else, right? So that may be like, okay, for the household example, because it's just so simple. So I have a high standard in terms of like, I want my family to eat well. I want them to eat nutritious food, right?
Right.
And I'm going to broaden the standard to say another piece of it actually is I want the food making to be collaborative. Like that's part of the high standard I'm holding is I want a system in which everyone is contributing. And so I'm going to invest in that, right? What would that look like in an institution if you were like, okay, I have a high standard for helping these students. And at the same time, I want to broaden my standard within my department, within my working group or whatever. I want to broaden that to include, I want to say like realism, like just a more practical and realistic idea of like what it could look like. Like what comes to mind for you as a way to broaden that past like I'm doing excellent advising?
Right. I think where my brain goes with that is like, we need to rethink how we're doing advising just like systematically and logistically. Like, do we really need to meet with every single student under our care in a personal one-on-one meeting?
Right.
Or could we do some kind of small group? Like, yes, I understand we put on an orientation and half the students come, so you miss them or whatever. Like the old way, if the old way is we do one big orientation meeting, then everybody learns who their advisor is, and then everybody's supposed to meet with their advisor. And each professor has 10 students and you're supposed to meet with them for like an hour. And that's like 10 hours a semester.
Yeah.
That is like a super high burden. Could there be one small group meeting with the professor where everybody's like getting advised together, and then personal questions having to do with grades could be a little side conversation? Is there a way to create a different system? Like that's another thing that I see happening in academia. Like we have these like, well, this is the way we do it because this is the way it's always been done.
Right.
And there was a good reason for that way. And then it feels like we can't argue against that reason. Like, oh, but students' grades are private, for example. Like I hear this a lot about why somebody can't have like an executive assistant in their inbox. Oh, because students are emailing me about grades or private situations. And that would be, I can't have like a third person seeing that or whatever.
Right.
So yes, that sounds like an argument that you can't get around, but there's also like those systems were built at a different time. And now the situation has changed. The institutions have changed. Like you were saying at the beginning, right? Everything's always changing. So
right.
We can change these rules. We can find different technologies that could assist us in doing the things we need to do.
Yeah.
And just different approaches, because I like that idea of like broadening, because I think one of the things that my clients feel resistant to is like, well, if I say no, like if I say, no, you can't assign me 10 undergrad students, they know that what their chair is going to do or what the dean's going to do is turn around and pick somebody else. And then that person's the burden just is like handed over onto somebody else. And then you don't want to be responsible for somebody else like that either.
Right.
But what you're saying is like, if we broaden our standards and where my brain goes, like, could we create something different? Like, could we just create like a new system?
Oh my gosh, I love that. And of course, as a coach who loves doing group coaching, I'm also thinking, how incredibly fruitful could that be, right?
Yeah.
If you had like smaller groups where you're like, okay, so students who are majoring in English and are interested in a double major have a small group where they can learn from each, because this is the other thing, right? Is that like when we are more collaborative and less individualistic in the hyper responsibility, right? When we're more collaborative, then what we're doing, which I could see could be a lot bit countercultural in academia, is we're saying, I'm actually not the sole expert here.
Yes.
Right? We're saying, oh, there are actually many ways to approach this, and you can learn from your fellow students here. Like we could have different approaches here. maybe you could have one advisor who's helping you think through double majors, and you could have another advisor who's helping you prepare for graduate school, right?
Yeah.
Like maybe there's actually more than one. And to me, that sounds so dream come true. That sounds so fruitful. And yeah, it would take a lot of reconfiguring for sure.
Yes.
Right. And I get also, I just will be very frank about it, that reconfiguring probably sounds like a whole other job also.
Yeah. And that's the thing too, though, that like we have to recognize that like there's like whole other jobs
Yeah.
kind of coming up all the time as you're cutting jobs, as systems and cultures, institutions evolve, right? Like they're changing, things are different. Like, yeah. And I think that one of the things that I try to encourage my clients to do is to say, like, here's an idea I have. And instead of just saying, I'll do it, right? Back to the group work kind of thing, right?
Yep.
Say, like, this is my idea. I don't want to do it. So here you can have the idea, have fun.
Right.
Or this is my idea. Here's what I would need, right? In order to implement this idea.
Yeah.
Here's the kind of support I would need. I need this many hours of, administrative assistance. I would need this. I would need a room that could meet students in. I would need blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And so if you would like for me to take this on, here's what I need.
Yeah.
And I continually asking, like both identifying what you need and asking for it.
Yeah. And I'll just say, like, what a functional evolutionary use of your over responsibility to say, you know what, I actually have an idea that can evolve this whole thing forward. So I'm willing to do that. That feels so much more like energizing than let me use my over to shoulder the burden that has been lain upon me, right? It's like, it's so much more creative to do the thing that you have the idea for. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. That reminds me of kind of like the next place I wanted to go with you on the podcast today. Yeah. So I think, and I don't know if this would be your interpretation of our work together, but I think for me that two questions that came out of and continue to come out of our work together that are hard to answer are, what do you want?
Yeah.
And what do you need? So I continue to throw these back at my clients all the time, since they are the questions that I wrestle with like constantly.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, like, maybe start with like the what do I want question? Like, why do you think it's hard to answer that question?
Well, in most cultures on the globe, not all, but most cultures on the globe, desire, and specifically desire held by women, is demonized, dangerous, very, very scary.
Yeah.
And I think that is so deeply ingrained in us that it is not okay to want, or rather, I would say, here's what it's okay to want. And it basically has to do with men.
Right. Yeah.
Wanting what men want you to want, that's okay. But other than that, like, no, not so much. Right.
Yeah.
And P.S., I think this is actually in Western culture with puritanical roots. Like, it's for all humans. We all have a weird, especially with capitalism thrown in there. It's like we all have a very convoluted, ambivalent relationship with desire. But for women specifically, like, desire is so carefully controlled and warned against, right? So I think that's the first reason it's really hard to know what we want. The second reason is, I think this thing that happens is my great friend, Latondra Murray, calls this curated wants. We have curated wants where it's like, I want to jog, right? Like,
Yes,
I
right.
want to be a jogger. I want to meditate for 30 minutes every morning, where we have these things that are such shoulds.
Yes.
And especially, I think, are very compelling for high standards people, because we want to maximize. We want to do our very best, right? And so we're like, oh, I should be waking up at 4:30 a.m. and having a morning routine that includes meditation and an outdoor walk, all of this stuff. So these curated wants, they are tricky. Like they trick us, and we actually can even still think we want them. We have to take many steps in the direction of them to figure out, oh, actually, this is a no for me, right? So yeah, I think those are the major things. The maybe one more I would say is that for me at least, discovering whether or not something is truly a desire for me, is something I truly want, requires checking in with my body. And I don't know about you, but I have spent many decades as a brain floating around in flesh.
Yes.
Like, I love to analyze, I love to be up in my head. And so to really pull my awareness down into my body so that I can feel my way to an answer rather than think my way to an answer, that has taken a lot of practice to figure out how to do that.
Yes. And I will also say too that because of those want to wants or the should wants, it takes, for me, I'll say personally, for me, it has taken a long time to work through those. And exactly like you said, like I walked in the direction of those should wants and tried them on and was like, this is what I should want. Here we go. And that's what it took to realize I didn't want it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for maximizers, it feels like, well, that was a big waste of time. And then you have to deal with your shame around, why did I want the wrong thing?
I know.
Stupid, but whatever.
But, though, full circle again to this, everything is always changing. We're always evolving. Yeah. Maybe you did really want that. Maybe it was the best direction, but then the department changed or the colleagues changed or some new opportunity opened up or some opportunity that was there is no longer there, right? It's like everything's always changing. And so our desires will also change.
Yeah. All right. The second question to me, which is the corollary question to what do you want, is the what do you need question.
Yeah.
Right. And that's something that I remember that we worked on a lot in the last year, which is you're allowed to need things.
Yeah.
You can need stuff. I think that's a really hard thing. Again, for this same type of person who is the group leader. It's I don't need anybody else's help. I can do it all by myself. And then we do that for so long, we forget or we smush down all the thoughts that are wow, I really need X, Y, or Z. And then letting yourself need something becomes a problem.
Yeah. There is a piece here too. And I never want to make assumptions but I see that a lot of us who are hyper responsible, we've done this since childhood.
Yep.
In many times because actually we were a parent in our households, not necessarily, right? I'm not talking about, oh, no one was there at all. Let's face it, you minded yourself. You looked after yourself. You kept track of yourself, maybe in a bigger way than even you realize, right? If you really look back to that time and say, wow, yeah, I did take a lot of responsibility for raising myself. Yeah. And I think that also makes it difficult to need, right? Yeah. Because it's you don't even maybe know how.
Yes.
I'm exaggerating a little bit, but on purpose, right? You have provided for yourself. You have been very self-sufficient, very autonomous. Maybe you've even given from the overflow to your siblings, your neighbors, your friends, right? Your group and your group project.
Yeah.
So to be in a place where you sit back and receive rather than giving and offering, to be in a place where you say, okay, hold on. I need time, energy, resources, support, help, whatever, in order to be able to continue or sustain. It does feel, I think, existentially different. It's like, this is a different way of being in the world, because the way that I'm used to being in the world is I'm Olivia Poping it. I'm just handling it.
Yeah. So good. All right. As we wrap up, Natalie, tell the people where they can hear more from you. What do you want them to do?
Yeah. Well, if you would like to read what I write, you can subscribe to my Sunday letter. And if you would like to hear me talk about things, you can listen to my podcast, Mind Witchery. And both of those are accessible through my website, nataliekmiller.com.
Yay. I have to say, and all of you listening know that I send a lot of emails, but I don't read many people's email letters, but I always read Natalie's letter. And I also love the little, like Natalie does little recommendations at the end sometimes. So they're really good. And the Mind Witchery podcast is just wonderful. And can Natalie work a metaphor? So if you like, if you want to jump in with 2 feet to metaphors, listen to the podcast because it's so great. Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're so welcome. I feel compelled to say, Kathy, if it's okay.
Yes, please.
Once upon a time, I was a PhD student. I didn't say that before, but I am ABD actually. And that's kind of another piece, is like, if you want to see like what happened to someone who loves to think about things and work a metaphor and analyze and express, like someone who leaves like, well, this is what I've done with it. And it is a version of walking my talk around the high standards, right? Like it turned out that for me, continuing in academia was not aligned. And so like I found my other way to teach and to move things forward. And I am proud of it. Yeah.
I want to just underline that, because one of the things that I say on my podcast, right, is that you are not the container. Like you are you, and you do work through the container of the university if you're a professor. But you would say, I'm a professor, but you aren't. You are you doing your work through this container of being a professor. And there are other containers. There's many other containers, and you can shape and reconfigure your container. You don't have to sit with the container that you feel like maybe you've been dealt.
Absolutely. Can I actually work a metaphor right here?
Yeah, do it.
So this is what I felt like leaving academia. It's like if you've ever gone shopping for a lamp in IKEA. You go into IKEA, you're in the sphere of IKEA, and for a moment, it really feels like these are the only lamps available. Like, these are my choices. None of them are speaking to me, but these are the only lamps available to me. That is what it felt like for me to be in academia. I was like, okay, these are the only options available, right? And it is that over-identification with the container, Kathy. I love that you remind people of that.
Yeah.
And leaving was like walking out of IKEA and going, wow, there's so many lamps out here, right?
Yeah.
And no, they don't have meatballs and Cinnabons, or they do actually. Those are out here. Yeah. So I love that you say that. That's beautiful.
Yeah. So good.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Natalie, so much for being on the podcast.
Listen, it's just a treat to get to hang out with you, Kathy. You're my favorite.
Yay. You're my favorite too.
Thank you so much for spending your valuable time supporting yourself and your writing by listening to this episode. If you like what you heard today, the best way to say thank you is to hop on over to Apple iTunes and write an honest review. The more reviews, the more amazing academic women and non-binary people will find this podcast. So go write one now.